I wasted a ton of money because I would just get DoorDash all the time. That's a personal failure, not nothing else. Shout outs to my DoorDash drivers. This is not a spot to start discourse.
You're the real heroes.
Yes, that's right. I respect my boys in red.
Hello.
Hey,
Welcome to Left and Red. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
Yeah, we're just two scientific socialists seeking the means of liberation in a potentially post-revolutionary era.
Word. This go-around, we are returning to Dr. Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1.
Yes, that's right. So glad you've been reading with us. We're officially past the halfway point of this book, I'm happy to say. I know it's been a bear, but I appreciate what we've been reading, and I appreciate you guys reading with us, as I know you all have.
Of course. And we have read for this episode chapters 12, 13, and 14.
Yes, a heavy one, 13 at least. Marx talks about machinery for 130 pages.
Yeah, quite a bear. Not the easiest chunk of this book that we have read thus far, in my experience at least.
You know, my benchmark is when we read chapter 3, and I'll say everything has been better than that so far. So, this was light work. I was like, hey, cruising through it.
Fair enough.
It was just long.
Yeah, it was just long. It was just a lot. It felt a little circular at times, or I know that at least twice I got maybe 10, 15, 20 pages in, and then he kind of summarizes everything in one paragraph.
Yeah.
I'm like, could have just
Awesome.
said that.
Well, you have to see all the links in the chain, Aaron.
I suppose.
You have to see him build it up. So, what we left off last, we were talking about cooperation, and what we had mentioned was that there are two other forms of generating relative surplus value available to the capitalist, which Marx continues on, the division of labor, and then finally, machinery.
Yeah, so chapter 12, the division of labor and the manufacturing system. I did find this one quite interesting.
Yeah, what I liked about these chapters is that he's still continuing a development. It wasn't until, when he starts talking about the manufacturing period, I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution and whatnot, but he's talking about a time before that, honestly. He's talking about, literally this transition of our mode of production from artisanal crafts and labor into a manufacturing, and then finally that crystallizing into the factory and then the automated factory. So we're seeing this kind of progression of technology in relation to the development of capital and capitalists. And I think that was pretty nice.
Yeah, I would agree. And what I think is most interesting about watching that development as Marx lays it out, and what stood out to me most about chapter 12, and he even continues to develop it in chapter 13, obviously, as he starts talking about technological advance in machinery, is this kind of reduction of craft that happens as the manufacturing system gets developed to the point of creating quote-unquote unskilled labor and ultimately reducing the value of labor power because what used to be a holistically skilled craftsperson gets reduced to a single kind of act in the process.
Yeah.
And they refine that so greatly to increase productivity, but at the expense of everything else. And I have a lot of comments about that throughout these couple of chapters, I guess.
Sure.
That was kind of the primary thread running through my reading of it.
Yeah, I mean, normally when we talk about the division of labor, we think of it in a positive aspect, We're dividing up the labor to more efficiently use labor to produce more in less time. And Marx is talking about the exact same thing, but he's talking about it in the context of who owns the means and also what they're ultimately being used for, which is, in this case, commodity exchange. I mean, they're in the quest for exchange value more than anything else, and that's what's driving a lot of stuff. I mean, something that really struck me here is the way that Marx, it's obvious when you think about technology on its own in this way to meet a need. That's why technology is developed. But the way Marx is connecting the development of our sciences, our math, the study of astrology, the study of friction, all of these to developments in how we are making the things that sustain our lives. And I just think that that's a connection that many people don't actually make, is the fact that we did a lot of this technological innovation because it was necessary for our survival as well. And part of that is the development of capitalism. I'm not trying to give capitalism too much credence here, but because of the need to expand our mechanical apparatus as capitalism developed, technology also had to develop with it. And, much in the same way, I know this is getting ahead, but the way that Marx talks about the need to constantly revolutionize, that's where I see the kernel of people talking about like capitalism breeding innovation because they're seeing that progression of development alongside the progression of capital.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think he's also planting the seeds or continuing to sow the seeds that have been planted already about capitalism ultimately necessarily leading to colonialism and how technology plays a role in that as well.
Yeah. I mean, he even starts with that in the division of labor, just to go back to what you were just talking about. Even when we think of specialization as a positive thing, it's not impossible to think of someone specializing into like unskilled labor the way that Marx talks about. The worker's purpose is created to only serve these jobs, this labor. Now, that's still specialization in its own right. It's just that it's specialization downwards in a downwardly mobile fashion, rather than we normally think of it upwards in terms of like getting more education, getting more skills.
Yeah, it's a narrowing. It's not a refining.
Yeah.
To put it in that way, I guess. Like, to use an example, I mean, he opens with an example of a carriage assembly.
Yes.
Which I think is useful. But to use an example of like a woodworker, someone that's well-versed in handicraft and can build tables, right? That's many different skills that are necessary in order to create that one commodity. You can, through the manufacturing system, make a table more productively, more efficiently by separating each of those processes and having multiple workers specialize in any individual thing. But knowing how to cut a mortise doesn't mean you know how to make a table.
Yeah.
And someone that maybe once was, in the artisanal sense, well-versed in all of the handicraft necessary to make a table, what Marx is arguing is that through the refinement of the manufacturing system where all they're doing all day is cutting mortises, you eventually lose all of the other peripheral skills, and so therefore you're no longer a skilled handy person. You're no longer skilled in that handicraft. You're skilled at one very tiny, narrow, refined thing.
Yeah.
And that's very good for the capitalist, but hurtful to the worker.
Yeah, I was thinking about guilds just now because, like, there still was a division of labor under that kind of artisanal craftsmanship. Like people had apprentices, but the difference is that the people who owned those means were the guilds, right? And the people that were brought into that, that heavily guarded knowledge almost, or I guess it was more of a privilege of production, I should say. They were brought in it with the intent of learning the rest of the skills, We're in the capitalist mode of production. That person is wrung dry, essentially, rather than using the tools use them. That's what Marx says that I think is so good. And it's like, they're using the labor until it is depleted, and then there's nothing else there. They're tossed aside, and they go to the market and bring in another person, essentially. And going back to that division of labor, I mean, he even extends the skilled and unskilled gap to the town and the country. I mean, I think that that's so interesting because it's like different levels of the replication of the same division. There's skilled and unskilled labor, there's the town versus the country, and then there's the global north and the global south. You know what I mean? Like, you can see how that colonial structure is a replication and extension of the same system of the division of labor that Marx is describing here.
Yeah.
We've talked so frequently about how so many of these thoughts are so far-reaching, and I mean, 1867, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, to use the example that he opens chapter 12 with, the carriage example, I'm really stuck on this thing about narrowing craft and like robbing craftspeople of their skill through the manufacture, being forced through the sieve of the manufacturing system. Because the example of the carriage that he gives, he writes, for example, a carriage was once the product of many different craftsmen working on their own. Wheelwrights, harness makers, tailors, locksmiths, upholsterers, turners, fringe makers, glaziers, painters, polishers, gilders, and so on. And what I think is so fascinating about that is that there is clearly a division of labor there where all of these different skilled craftspeople have a specialty that is necessary to come together to create the carriage. But within each of those specialties, there are multiple skills, multiple things that are at play. Like a wheelwright knows how to do everything necessary to make a carriage wheel, where the manufacturing system is going to, once it starts bringing all of those different skills in-house, which he says is ultimately what's going to happen,
right,
and then refines each of them even further, every individual worker, no one is a wheelwright anymore. You're the one that turns the spokes, and it completely robs the worker of their agency when they're entering the marketplace because their labor value, the power of their labor value is like way lower now.
Totally. We'll certainly touch on this when we talk about machinery displacing workers, because that's exactly the thing. It's like these people are literally displaced. They're pushed out into the labor force, and there's a consequence of that. Primarily, the fact that they can only work in essentially lower organizations of labor, is what Marx says, and that changes the value of labor on the market. It brings it down. So I just think it's, God almighty. Yeah, keep unskilled labor in mind, because we're going to touch on that for sure. I have some serious thoughts about what's going on today in terms of skilled versus unskilled labor.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that.
Yeah.
I would like to throw out this quote from the beginning of chapter 12 on 308, because this is where Marx is laying out what I'm describing here. He writes, as they grow unaccustomed to performing the full range of operations their crafts involve, they gradually lose the skills those operations require. Their newly specialized labor now takes on the form best suited for its more limited sphere of activity.
Yeah, I even love on 310, he says that there's two ways that manufacturing arises, whether it's a bunch of different parts being brought together or one part being worked on through a series of processes. The end goal is the same. Their final shape was always the same, a mechanism of production whose organs were human beings.
Yep.
Again, it's just this motif of living capital being enslaved by dead capital. This crystallized form of labor is now responsible for living labor. I mean, it's in control of it.
He goes on after that to talk about the specialized worker and his tools, and writes that a worker who spends his life performing one simple operation over and over again turns his whole body into an automatic, specialized organ of that operation, which he will carry out faster than a worker who performs a whole series of other tasks as well. The combined total worker, who constitutes the living mechanisms of the manufacturing system, is made up of just such specialized workers. I'm calling that the Voltron worker, because it used to be a situation where one craftsperson could do it all, but now they can't, and so it requires, with our powers combined, I guess that's Captain Planet, but you have to take all of these individual specialized workers to create the combined total worker now, which is only of a benefit to the capitalist.
Yes. I don't know, what I'm kind of grappling with right now is just the fact that, that socialized labor is what allowed for an increase in development in the world. It's not that it's the only option. I'm just thinking about what Marx says about a person sacrificing their individual power to bolster their collective power, right? They're sacrificing their individual intellect to bolster a social intellect. And it's to what extent has that needed to happen to sustain X or Y population? To talk about the, quote, development of humanity or whatever. It's I'm suffering from hindsight. It's this isn't the only way it could have developed, but it is the way it developed, And alongside it came with also the development of society. Again, not that other ways aren't possible, but that's simply the way that history has grown so far. I just find it hard to argue with what Marx is saying here, because he's really drawing it down to the most basic levels, and he's talking about...
Well, what I'm getting from it is, certainly this process where the individual worker is sacrificing themselves for the benefit of the collective worker, like you said, one thing it indisputably does is increase productivity. And that increase in productivity should help allow the advancement of everything to go much more quickly, which, with the benefit of hindsight, we can probably say was necessary to get to the stage that we are in.
Yeah.
He gets into something in the next chapter. I don't want to jump super ahead too quickly, but there are a handful of quotes where I was like, this could have been used, quote, for good. Mm-hmm. The problem is that this advancement, this increase in productivity, or the mechanization of a process to increase productivity could have been used to reduce the toil of the individual worker. Yeah. But under the system of capitalism, it will never do that. It will always be used by the capitalists to increase the level of surplus value that they can wring out of any individual worker. And so, to a point, that productivity is necessary. And, maybe you could argue that it's necessary to see it move to the point of exploitation, to the point that it creates enough antagonisms that people will rebel against it. But I don't know, I feel like there is a space in there where it's we could have all done this without going through that step.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I mean, that's the whole point. It's we've come to the point where society is based on a social means of production, but it's not owned socially, So, I guess that makes sense.
I don't know if I was interpreting what you were getting at.
No, I think you were spot on, because it's it's not about the necessity of these things. I don't know. I don't know. Just to follow up on, we were talking about unskilled labor, I was looking on 322, because he says that the manufacturing system thus creates a hierarchy of bearers of labor power and a corresponding wage scale. Skipping a little further down, this labor too no longer flows into more substantial activities, but instead petrifies as a series of exclusive functions. Hence, whenever the manufacturing system takes over a form of craft labor, it creates a class of so-called unskilled workers, whom craft industrialists had strictly excluded. It's also the case that the manufacturing system begins to make the lack of any training into a specialty. As the hierarchical ordering of workers takes shape, so too does a simple distinction, skilled versus unskilled labor.
Yep.
So just kind of to put a cap on that point there.
Yeah, and his point there, he closes that section by saying either way, labor power's value falls. It directly implies a greater valorization of capital, for everything that shortens the time it takes to reproduce labor power enlarges the domain of surplus value.
Yeah. So we're still just talking about all the ways that surplus value can be expanded, whether that's relative or absolute. I don't even think Marx really thinks it matters all that much at the end of the day. I mean, just thinking about chapter 14, when he's kind of like, what's really the difference? You know,
Yeah.
one can be the other.
And I found myself making sure I remembered the distinction between those while I was reading this, because he's not using that language. He's just saying surplus value.
Right.
And so I was like, does it matter?
Yeah.
I was asking myself that question.
Well, I think that it matters historically, you know, in the way that they're talking about the development from artisanal craft to manufacturing to industrialization. It's really interesting to think about the way that the workday was expanded, because in whatever time before, people worked until they generated their means of subsistence, then maybe they worked to fulfill their feudal lord or whatever a little bit, and then the rest of the time was theirs. But it's really interesting to think of the way that the workday was expanded by industry, essentially, to the point where people were working, 14, 18 hours in factories. And what Marx is saying we're seeing there is the drive for capitalism to expand their surplus value. And they started with the one that they could do the easiest, which is absolute surplus value.
Yeah.
That could only be done by the expansion of the workday.
Just work longer.
Exactly, and then eventually, he says, to the point where society was threatened to its existence, right? The law had to come in and say, we need to regulate the workday. Even thinking about Marx talking about the state as a tool to mediate between classes, the law had to step in, but only at the point where the order of society was threatened, right? The state intervened only once it became completely detrimental to the capitalist class, you know? The thing is, and I know I'm just kind of summarizing here, but like, once you expand that workday to a certain point, once it becomes regulated, what do you do then? Even before we talked about law, the workday is already regulated by physical and natural limits, you know? It can't be more than 24 hours, good God.
Yeah.
And so at that point, it's like, what do you do? Well, I have to focus not on absolute surplus value, but instead on the relative surplus value. And that only comes from changing labor power. There's that revolutionizing of the labor process again and again, because that's what's left, within the limits of the law, which they will happily change if they can. That's the only way they can do it. And so, yeah, there is a drive for technology there. But again, it is to our detriment and to the Earth's.
Yeah, for sure. For sure that.
Marx talks a lot about the conditions in England especially, which I thought was useful, but I doubt we'll really have any space to mention here. Might I say, though, I will take a moment to appreciate the 4-page long footnote. Yeah, I turned the page and was slapped in the face. I saw the line at the top and I went, no, surely not. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. 4 full pages, footnote only. Marx is like, well, you might not have read the coal miners, report, but I did. Let me summarize it for you here. But there is a quote on 328 that I really loved, because something that Marx does here when he's talking about this development is that he talks about the contradictions that arise as a consequence of this development. And I think that, he does that to bring it up as kind of this impetus, this motivational force, something that's driving a change in form ultimately, whether that's from manufacturing to factory or from factory labor to the automated factory. It comes as a result of a contradiction that's being built up. And I think there's a great example on 328, because he says, under the capitalist mode of production, the anarchy of the social division of labor and the despotism of the manufacturing system condition each other, right? There's a push and a pull there. I don't know. I had contradiction on the mind a lot while we were reading this.
Yeah, there's a line on the previous page, actually, that I really liked that I'd like to read here, and I think speaks to that same sort of hypocritical, contradictory nature. It's at the bottom of 327. It reads, "Thus, the same bourgeois consciousness that eagerly lauds the division of labor in the manufacturing workshop, where the worker is permanently annexed to a specialized area and unconditionally subordinated to capital, that celebrates this as a form of organization that increases labor's productive power, is just as quick to criticize all conscious attempts by society to monitor and regulate the social production process, decrying them as attacks on the inviolable property rights, freedom, and even the self-determining genius of the individual capitalist."
Yeah.
So, it's like socialism for the rich, capitalism for the rest of us. They
Totally.
can dish it out, but they can't take it.
Well, it's so funny to think about it that way because, the capitalist does want freedom. They want to free the laborer from their wages, from their time, from their means of subsistence.
There's a great footnote. Oh, fuck. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. I even love the next line just while you're searching for that, where he says, "The harshest thing enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have to say about the prospect of generally organizing social labor is this: it would transform all of society into a factory."
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, the line that I'm thinking of is actually at the start of the next chapter, so I don't necessarily want to jump there immediately if we still have more to say, but I do want to read this, the way it opens in the footnote, because Marx starts chapter 13 with a quote from John Stuart Mill,
Yeah.
Famous economist philosopher, who writes, "It is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being." And Marx's footnote is great. He says, "Mill should have said, of any human being not fed by other people's labor, for machinery has without question greatly increased the number of elegant loafers."
Marx has a lot of sly shots in this. I love when he says, even the English Parliament, of which no one would claim genius. That's so good.
Yeah.
But hold on, though, because there is something on 327 that I think is really interesting, and it's where he talks about, he doesn't quote anybody. What am I talking about? I wrote Hobbes on the side, because he says this: "The division of labor within society places opposite one another independent commodity producers who recognize no authority except that of competition, i.e. the coercive force exerted by the pressure of their competing interests, just as in the animal kingdom, the bellum omnium contra omnes preserves every species' condition of existence to greater or lesser degree." First off, that Latin there, sorry if I butchered it to our Latin listeners, is literally war of everyone against everyone. And it really made me think of when we read Mutual Aid. How much is this view of nature as this all-out battle, this Hobbesian war, conditioned by the way that we are interacting with each other through commodity exchange? We see our lives as a competitive marketplace. I can see that being extended to the natural world as well. It just makes me think about the conflict between natural competition and mutual aid, especially because when Kropotkin was talking about it, it wasn't that he was refuting competition, but he was simply saying that it might have been overstated.
Yeah.
How much of that is a reflection of the fact that we are driven into competition by capitalism?
It's like a narrative framing kind of thing. It's not quite a chicken or an egg situation, but it's like, how much is our view of nature shaped by the social relation of the way we have to live under capitalism versus nature shaping the social relation of capitalism?
Sure. I even think, in the way we think of domination of nature comes from maybe the fact that we dominate each other. We dominate animals. I mean, I think it's all wrapped together. I don't know. Something that Reading Capital has done a lot is really solidified that materialist perspective, where it's what we are doing to produce things is changing our reality, is shaping our view.
Yeah.
These chapters especially, I think, did a lot for that.
100%.
So just wanted to mention Hobbes there, because I've had, anytime Marx brings up animals now, he talks about humans elevating them above the animal plane, or even talking about exciting the animal spirit. I always think of our conversation on veganism now because it's just contextualized in a different way.
Yeah, I always note those when we're reading them. The animal spirit one really jumped out to me as well. It was a few pages back, but
I think it's interesting too. No, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but reading these in context now, it makes me feel softer for Marx in that perspective. I think that when he thinks about an animal spirit, he's thinking about a sense of freedom in a way I don't know. I don't think it's as, I don't want to say speciesist, because I do think that there's still something there. But I don't think it's as willing to isolate humanity from animals as we might think.
Okay. I think I would agree with that. I think, no one is separated from their time, from context.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what Marx has written, we've noted some things that maybe seem a little anti-Semitic. I've noted some things that maybe sound a little speciesist.
Even earlier when he says Hindus and spiders alike, I was like, oh.
Okay. Yeah, there's some stuff in the next chapter where I'm like, is Marx a misogynist or is he quoting misogynists? So, I mean, there's always going to be a little bit of that. But I do think it's fair to say that his reference to like the animal spirit isn't some sort of reductive speciesist attitude of maybe more of something, like you said, about freedom, unencumbered by manufactured
separation.
Yeah.
Fair enough. You know, I think it's interesting the way he talks about development in other nations. Like he talks a lot about India and the way that like caste system in reflection of the guild system as a way that like these specialized skills were passed down, but they were still closely guarded. I even love the way that he talks about merchant capital. I don't know if it's in this chapter, but he says that that's the distinction between guilds and the merchants. The merchants could buy any commodity except labor. That was strictly protected by the guilds, and that's what made the difference. Same with usury. These forms existed before capitalism as we know it, and he says that they might have even served as a transitional form. I was thinking a lot about debt here. Not that I've read it, but especially David Graeber's argument about debt in his book about debt, which I'm sure is called
Debt,
where he says that debt essentially preceded money. People were more willing to give loans in the sense of in kind well before we thought about money. And so I think it's interesting to think about usury capital as a, you know, or even merchant capital as something that was preceding but then led into as a transitional form, you know, in the same way that debt might have preceded, I mean, debt did precede money, but its inclusion into society, the inclusion of debt as a system, helped at least not necessitate, but led to the development of money as that mediating commodity. You know, it's not that people thought up money and said, we'll use this to mediate everything. It's that people needed something to mediate everything and then thought of money.
Yeah.
Right.
I have a couple other random things from this chapter.
Yeah, same here. I was looking at 331 when he says that it stunts the worker, turns him into a freak. And he even kind of calls to something similar on 333. In the mid-18th century, in fact, some manufacturing workshops preferred to have half-idiots perform certain operations that, while simple, were also trade secrets. He might be using that term in an ableist way, but I took it to mean something kind of similar, like someone separated from their whole self, from their full capacity. Totally. I mean, even in an ableist sense, like capitalism is more than willing to exploit the most vulnerable people in our society because they can exploit more out of them. I mean, Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, not that you don't know that. Just needed to be said. I mean, that's how I read that when he said half idiots. Even later when he talks about the British refusing to mechanize certain aspects of society because that's what the wretch does, you know? And it's like, that's just the term they used for agricultural workers. But like even the framing of that class of society as wretches, I think is quite telling.
Yeah.
You know, I'm trying to figure out when I want to talk about AI, because here's when I put my note about AI.
Okay.
But I think it might be better off later in the machinery section. Well, I'm looking at 334 because I think that he talks about a division between hand labor and head labor.
Yeah.
And I think that really made me think of AI, and then this was reinforced later in the machinery section because of the way that I think that AI will ultimately be used to transform head labor into hand labor. I think that we're lowering essentially the floor for intellectual labor in that sense with the introduction of AI. And in the same way that the use of machinery separates a worker from the substance of his labor, I think that AI as a machine also separates a worker from his substance of labor. And if that is expanded to include intellectual work, which obviously it is, I mean, that's pretty jarring to society as a whole. So I had AI on the mind a lot here.
Same.
Not only because of, you know, the way that AI is rapidly developing. I mean, you know what, 30% of jobs will probably be threatened by AI, you know? And it's like, I'm not the person that's saying AI makes you dumber necessarily.
I am.
Well, that's the thing, right? I'm not saying that by necessity using AI makes you dumber, but I am saying that AI will be used to make you dumber. All the ways in which we are currently using AI are making you dumber. It's not that AI itself makes you dumber. I saw the MIT study, you know, I don't know if you saw that one where they talked about a decrease in brain mass for people using ChatGPT for day-to-day tasks.
Yeah, I saw that.
The study itself is a little more complex than that. Shout outs to the Real Corn Pop for his video explaining. If you haven't seen it, go check it out on TikTok. But I do think that by necessity, all of the ways that AI will be implemented in our society on a large, functional, society-shifting level will be engineered to make us dumber. And I think that the way that intellectual labor is being downgraded into essentially like I can type in a prompt and let the computer brain sort it out for me is just like genuinely appalling.
Yes, there are many, many, many reasons to be opposed to AI. The climate issue being at the fore. Mm-hmm. The issue of training off of stolen labor is also at the fore.
Absolutely.
These are reasons that you should be morally against the use of AI, but pragmatically, we should be against the use of AI largely because it is one piece. I'm not saying it is the only piece, but it is one of many pieces of the puzzle of anti-intellectualism that are working to make us dumber, make us more docile, make us more complacent, and not only unwilling, but also unable to object to the conditions that we are being forced into.
Yeah.
And I think it's an extension of the exact same thing that Marx was talking about in this chapter, where he's talking about the narrowing of skill. Like you said, once that's extended to every intellectual action, all of the head labor that goes into any particular act, you know what I mean? Once that gets taken over, what is fucking left? You're a meat sack.
Yeah.
You're just a vessel through which all of this stuff is being passed. You're adding nothing. You are gaining nothing.
The organ in the machine, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Totally. And I just think that's really terrifying. I mean, I'm not afraid of my own Leadism in that regard because, you know, as Mark says here, they were right. They saw the writing on the wall and acted appropriately.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that it's just a big debate right now I'm seeing online about the usage of AI, like putting the toothpaste back into the tube and all of that. And it's like, I understand that completely. But I think that everybody needs to understand what actually will, you know, what AI will actually be used for. And even then, I think that AI... God, it's like a fucking buzzword, you know? Like, when we're talking about AI in this sense, we're talking ostensibly about large language models. You know, we're not talking about AGI or whatever. We're not talking about the Star Trek computer. Like, you know, we're talking about the autocomplete on your phone.
Yeah.
Like, that's really what it is, you know? And the question of, like, how willing are you to accept AI in your life is obviously a sliding scale because we already accept it in so many ways, you know? And there's ways in which I can understand the use of AI and still accept them. Like, the algorithms that are used for your social media, that might be an acceptable use of AI, except, right, who controls those things?
Being weaponized,
Exactly, right? Here's a different example where I feel less crazy about it. On Spotify. When I get recommended new music by Spotify, I'm more than happy for that because it's algorithmically detected that it's similar enough to my interest that it says, let's take a chance and serve it to this guy. Clearly, that comes with its own problems, but they're all problems of taste. There could be problems of curation in that regard. I mean, this isn't AI, but I'm thinking about a couple years back when they put Drake's picture on the front of every single playlist on Spotify, even if it was like, you know, instrumental chill out. Drake just going like, yeah. There's still an issue there, but in the same way, if an algorithm allows me to find new music, like I'm not necessarily opposed to that, even though I would definitely prefer human curation in that regard.
Yeah. My response to all of that is that if we can remove the other two issues that I mentioned, the climate issue, which is a huge pressing issue with the use of AI. Check out Mexi's video on YouTube about it. She did an excellent job explaining the climate problem with AI. And the issue of stealing the labor of individuals to train, that's mostly for image search stuff. But, the same thing with language
too.
models.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
If we could get around those issues, is there a quote-unquote ethical way to use AI or a useful way, a productive way to use AI that is not inherently anti-intellectual? I think the answer is yes. And I think that there are a lot of tasks that email jobbers are made to do that could easily be taken over by an algorithmic model or whatever. I'm an idiot. I don't know what words to use. But for example, the work that I do at my job, one of my tasks is each week I have to run this report. I pull a CSV file that's spit out, and then I have to do all of this organization with it. And this week I ran into an issue where for some reason the CSV did not format every cell in a particular column as a date. So even when I went in and tried to tell it, use date value and tell it that those are dates, it's not recognizing it. And I just quit. But what I really should have done, or in theory what would be necessary is I have to go in and manually change every one of those. It's not reading as a date to to effectively use this report. Now, like the question of how meaningful is that report in the long term? Yeah, okay, whatever. But like in the here and now, that's a task that a person shouldn't be made to do. A machine could very easily sort through.
Sure. But do you mind if I interrupt you?
Go ahead.
I think this is where the link to Marx's, intuitions on machinery really come in play here because, when some of those things are outsourced, I think what necessarily happens is a decrease in the labor. We're doing the work that would have otherwise required 3 email jobbers, with 1 email jobber and ChatGPT to assist, right? Just as a personal connection, this has really been on my mind because at the job I work in a warehouse, okay? We take in donated goods. We take pictures of them, we write a description, and we list them online. And recently, what's happened is that my boss got demoed and will certainly introduce an AI labeler. So they just take the pictures, they upload it, the AI then pushes out a description. It's perfect. They tried it on 25,000 different things or whatever, and that does the job for you, right? Yeah, it does save a ton of time that's otherwise, literally like I'm just typing in stuff, I'm doing whatever minimal brain work I need to. And the thing is, it's like, you go from being able to list 80 things in a day to 800 things in a day. But we don't get 800 things in a day. Let's just say for the working in the abstract.
In the abstract.
Say we can't increase our input there of goods to be listed. Suddenly you now have a bunch of people sitting around. Another way of looking at it, maybe from the boss's perspective, is that you could have done that work with less people. Right? What do you think is more expensive? What do you think is more of an obstacle to a business? Laying off an employee or building an entire supply chain below to input this now expanded service? I know where the writing on the wall is here. I can see it clearly because I know it's going to happen. And, they can tell me all they want that it's like, oh, we'll make sure everyone keeps their job. But if we're talking about the longest span here, I simply know better.
Yeah.
The trajectory of things looks grim. That's the thing, is that email jobbers will be hit the hardest, right? My job still has a physical aspect to it that will still be preserved for some employees, but the point is that some employees will be pushed out into the labor force. And if all they know is how to sort and type and describe goods, what other jobs are really available to them? I know that's a very reductive view of my coworkers, but it's all the same things that Marx is talking about, and again, and again, and again. This was 150 years ago.
Yeah, and he even says on 331, the minimum amount of capital in the hands of a single capitalist has to keep increasing. In other words, the amount of the social means of subsistence and means of production that are turned into capital has to keep growing. And if it weren't for the coercive forces of capitalism, this problem that you're describing wouldn't be a problem, because we would have a certain amount of whatever it is that needs to be produced, whatever the commodity is, that needs to be produced in order to sustain life for everybody in your area or whatever. Yeah. And then when you do that, you go home. You have a leisure time. You have a life outside of work.
Yeah.
And so an increase in productivity in this utopian world just means that, like, instead of it taking you 6 hours to sort those 80 things, now you've got this extra tool that lets you do it in 1. You've got 5 more hours of leisure time on your hands. But that's not the way that capitalism operates, and therefore any increase in productivity is always going to come down hardest on the worker.
Yeah, it's literally the labor having to be intensified rather than the workday expanded or decreased.
Yeah.
We're simply saying, we'll say less people do this. That's an increased intensity of labor because we're lowering the amount of, I've lost my Marxian terminology here. We're lowering the input cost, I guess. But the return is that person has to do more work, even if it's technically easier because of whatever tools they're given.
If you can lean, you can clean.
Dude, it's on my mind all the time, man. Because, I talk to my boss and I'm like, well, what are you going to have people do? And then he's like, well, if they have to, they'll just sit around. And I'm like, great answer, but then what? How long can that go?
Yeah.
How many bosses can walk by before they say, why the fuck is everyone just sitting around?
Yeah.
That's concerning to me.
One other thing about AI, and I guess I would expand it to not just be talking about AI, but to talk about automation and mechanization in industry altogether. On 389 at the top of the page, Marx is talking about machinery and automation taking over the world of manufacturing. And he writes, but whereas the manufacturing system has to consolidate its division of labor by always assigning a worker to the same function, machine-driven industry has no such need. The whole movement of the factory proceeds from a machine rather than a worker, and so labor personnel can be constantly moved around without disrupting the labor process. What this means is the factory, whatever you want to call it, the manufacturing floor can become so mechanized, so automated, that eventually machines are making machines or machines are running machines.
Yeah.
And what you've done, or what the capitalist has done, is invested so heavily in machinery to exercise the worker completely, or at least the worker that used to have to run every machine. Now, instead of having 100 workers running 100 machines, you have one overseeing the 100. And so you're removing the worker. And the thing that really stood out to me about this, or was really got me thinking about it, and it relates to all of his comments about colonialism here, is once you have done that, once you have mechanized the factory to a certain point, it becomes so much easier for the export of that industry to move all of the labor and all of the machines elsewhere. The American auto industry is a perfect example of this. Once NAFTA was signed in 94, 95, whenever that was.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, and GM moved everything to Mexico, basically, and Detroit was gutted because they no longer needed any of those workers who were highly skilled.
Highly specialized, too.
Highly specialized, highly skilled, no longer have a means of putting that skill and specialization to work because all of the machinery got exported.
Yep.
And so it's just another example of us kind of sowing the seeds of our own demise.
Yeah.
Or being victim to the capitalists sowing the seeds of our own demise.
It's incredible because, like, this is a notion that people are well aware of in capitalism. You know, when I studied economics, they called it the race to the bottom. This idea that's like, where on the globe can we get the cheapest labor? And it's because all of the constant capital has already been developed here. It's dead capital that's been crystallized, and now we're shipping it over to the places where we can get the cheapest variable capital. I mean, Marx even says that that surplus comes from, you know, it's just a maximization of their time, and along with that comes with the least wages possible. Yeah, exactly what you're saying about the colonial expansion. It's because just like in the division of labor, skilled and unskilled, just like in the separation of town and country, we need a reserve army of people to run as our variable capital. I love the quote that he says, I think it's from Ure, or Ure, I don't know how you say it, that guy, where he says that the factory is not only an automaton, but also an autocrat.
Yeah.
The shift has happened. You know, we're not talking about people using tools, but tools using people, right? Just as we said before, it's to the point, exactly as you're saying, that, like, the hands, as Marx says, can be anywhere in the world.
Yep.
It's totally crazy.
And I'm just thinking about the expansion of that same thing when we're talking about, like, AI. And there's no longer even necessarily a machine that needs to be run. It's some fucking supercomputer that's already housed elsewhere in the second world.
Yeah. All my supervisors and managers out there do not think you are safe because you watch other people. Okay? I already have seen people trying to train AI to manage businesses, to manage companies. I mean, there's a really funny one going on right now where they're trying to get a bunch of different AIs to run vending machine companies, and they all end up, like, completely blitzing out and losing their minds. Wow.
Speaking of blitzing out.
Yeah. You know, they start hallucinating, and it's because they're not doing actual thinking. They're regurgitating information that they've sourced from a million different places, most of the time Reddit, you know. So I can't keep saying, it's so true, but like, holy shit.
It's just fucking scary, man. I don't know why everyone isn't immediately rejecting the forced inclusion of AI in our lives.
Yeah, man. It's because I can generate Obama with a Hamas headband and no problem at all, you know? Dude, I mean, but it's beyond that. I mean, John Oliver just put out an episode about AI slop, and he's already talked about all the ways that it's, you know, been used to do, like, fake trials that people put on YouTube, and then boomers think it's real.
Yeah.
There's a crazy article in the New York Times that I read and also heard on a couple of podcasts where people were driven to the point of psychosis with AI, you know, and it's like, we're just unleashing this upon our populace.
Yeah.
Good luck. Here's a million Studio Ghibli, you know, style pictures of your dog or whatever.
Yeah.
Let's boil Memphis alive.
Fucking insane.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess moving on. I do want to point out one thing. You already called out a kind of Hobbesian reference, even though it wasn't direct. Marx has already named name dropped Plato in these chapters. It's, well established that his doctorate is in philosophy. Dude knows his philosophy, that's quite clear. But something that I thought was really funny is on 348, 349, he's talking about machine cooperation here at the bottom of 348. And he says, thus a weaving factory is made up of many mechanical looms operating side by side, and a sewing factory is made up of many sewing machines placed next to one another in the same building. However, there is a technological unity because the many identical working machines are driven by the heartbeat of a shared prime mover whose force is imparted to them simultaneously, blah, 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 blah. The prime mover is the thing that really stood out to me there, because in philosophy, that's code for God.
Oh, okay.
To call something the prime mover, that's an Aristotle thing. It's Aristotelian. He calls God the prime mover. And you might even argue that it's kind of a call to Thomas Aquinas, his first cause argument, which he calls God the first cause, the prime cause, so to speak.
Interesting.
It just really jumped out to me, and I was like,
yeah.
I don't know.
I was misled, not here, but when Marx says the caloric machine, I thought he was cheekily talking about humans. He's not. He was talking about some kind of fucking ancient ye old engine, dude.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Ye old engine?
It's an engine. It's like a hot air compression engine, basically. You light a fucking candle, and it heats up a tube, and it causes a wheel to spin or whatever.
That makes sense, because calories are a measure of heat.
There you go. I was the fool here. Yeah. Well, but he talks about a lot of, not anything that we have space to talk about, really, but I love the way that he talks about all the different inventions. Like, I had a great time looking up the flywheel and the slide rest, I was out here watching fucking 65-year-old men on YouTube talking about their vintage slide rest. Like, this is the first one that allowed you to do this and that. And I'm like, okay, now I know. Thank you, Dr. Karl Marx.
That's funny. Anyway, I just really wanted to call it the prime mover thing. It really stood out to me.
I'm glad you did, because I never, ever, ever would have caught that.
I cannot believe it is coincidence also. I think he is very deliberately using that
He's
phrase.
too sly not to. There's something interesting about, on 357, I mean, this is not necessarily an argument from Capital explicitly, but the way that Marx talks about the introduction of machinery not really reducing tools, but expanding them, or expanding the production of tools. There's kind of two pathways here, because even before manufacturing, Marx talks about all the different kinds of tools that are created, like this expansion of the domain of tools, I guess. And he says that machinery does something similar where it expands it out. And I was thinking about cheap tools. I was thinking about shitty tools. Mm-hmm. Obviously there's something to be said about the cost of things or whatever. But this expansion, this necessity of the expansion of the production of tools as a commodity, and maybe even commodities as a whole, I think obviously it lends itself to a reduction in quality as well. We need to expand to produce all of these different tools and also commodities at the cheapest, at the socially necessary labor, which Marx says is driven by supply and demand. He says it's mediated by competition, but that raising in demand as we expand this manufacturing system causes an expansion in production to the point where the quality is lowered. I just kind of had that thought here on 357, because he says machinery never adding more value to a product than it loses on average. I was getting my wires mixed up here, because when you talk about a machined good, in some ways you might think of it as cheaper, but in some ways you might think of it as more expensive, because the machinery that was required to build it is more expensive. And Marx does say something similar, but the difference is that the value of the machine is added to all of the tools it produces over its lifetime.
Yeah.
So comparatively, it's adding a relatively small amount of value. And that's the opposite of what I would think for a modern product or modern commodity. You think because it's machined or because it's gone through this industrial process that its value overall would be worth more. But the thing is, I think it's maybe more useful. It's more useful to think about value in terms of labor time, because the time that it takes is what is decreasing there. It's not necessarily that the value of the product is decreasing. I'm doing the fucking American thing that Marx says in that footnote where I'm mixing up value and price again. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I'm not entirely sure where you're going with that, but I have an example that maybe we might talk about. Because I'm thinking about this. First, the thing that stood out to me was the cost of the machine, or I guess the value of the machine, being a part of the ultimate cost or value of the commodity. Mm-hmm. So the number of commodities produced by that machine over its lifetime has an impact on how much value the machine imparts on that commodity.
Right.
So if you make 1,000 rulers, the cost of the machine is 1/1000th
Yeah.
If you make one, that's a very expensive ruler.
Yeah.
So there's that. I think I'm square with all that. What I'm thinking about is guitar production, the making of guitars. Okay. So for hundreds of years, luthiers have handmade guitars. And you controlled the quality of the instrument that you were getting by going to reputable luthiers, right? And what happened is here in the United States, when guitar manufacturing or the demand for guitars, electric guitars, boomed, basically after the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan and everyone wanted a guitar, there was limited manufacturing of guitars that were available. Like you had Leo Fender in California, and you had Gibson making guitars out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, and a couple of other relatively small luthiers that could like hand build you an instrument, right?
Right.
But then when the Beatles hit on Ed Sullivan and everybody wanted a guitar, there was so much demand that import guitars started coming in, and that's where you get a lot of made from cheaper materials, made with less precision, kind of instruments that get made. And so, like, for decades, there was this stigma, at least in the circles I was running in.
Yeah.
And the way I understand the history, there was a stigma around import guitars because they were always viewed as having less quality.
Yeah.
There was less control over the production of their manufacturer.
Obviously racist as hell, but I love the way that tradesmen talk about cheap tools as, like, made out of Chinesium,
Yeah, that's fucking racist.
Yeah, no shit. Thanks, Dad. Sorry.
But what's funny and ironic, I guess, especially relative to this chapter, is that as technology has increased, basically every electric guitar that is made now that's not made by a luthier, that's not still made in the traditional way by a craftsperson, is made 99% on a CNC. So a computer guides a router to cut everything within 1/1000th of an inch.
Just that beautiful slide rest again.
And so the quality of quote-unquote import guitars is equal to the quality of non-import guitars, because the non-import guitars, Fender and Gibson, have been using CNCs since the 80s also. And so it's like it's to some degree leveled the playing field that technology has increased everywhere.
I'm kind of viewing that right now as the expansion of the manufacturing process into a more artisanal craft, though, much in the same way that they talk about mechanization essentially pushing out. They're like consuming, like expanding out to these other branches of work, especially domestic labor, as Mark says here. I kind of see that as just another step in the process of industrialization. Not that that's not a value judgment or anything, but it's just like, that's a pretty direct example of manufacturing coming in and pushing out, in that sense, artisanal goods in the same way,
Yeah. I'll just give one final example to put a bow on it, because I'm thinking about this. There's a guitar manufacturer out of Maryland called PRS, very well known for being like really expensive, but really high quality guitars, started by one dude in a shop and then ultimately grew into like a pretty large business. They, because their guitars are so expensive, and after Carlos Santana, who was a famous PRS user, got huge with Smooth, there was a huge demand for PRS guitars that couldn't be met because they cost $4,000, and most people don't have that kind of money to shell out. So PRS started doing a secondary line that's manufactured overseas. I think it was originally in Vietnam, maybe Indonesia. I don't remember exactly where. But now the point is that those guitars, PRS SEs, are pretty much just as nice as the normal PRSs. That's the historic traditional PRS guitars. And it's just really funny that like they cost 1/3 of the price of a PRS, and they're just as good because, again, the technology is the great equalizer.
Yeah. I mean, dude, it's just like during the Liberation Day tariffs that Trump put out, all of these Chinese distributors flooded TikTok, and they were like, cut the shit. You can buy the same product here without LV stitched on it for $20 or whatever.
I saw a bunch of that.
Those are so good. Let me ask you a completely unrelated question. Do you think that in Black Magic Woman, it's a magic woman who's black, or do you think it's a woman who practices black magic?
I think the latter, not the former.
Interesting.
I hope, I guess.
Interesting. Okay.
It's not a black, magic woman.
I mean, when he sings it, it kind of is. I'm just saying. Now, there is one thing I was trying to look at here, because on 408, which I know is way deep, he does talk a little bit about luxury goods. That's what kind of was on my mind when you were talking about guitars. And I was trying to see if there was anything there.
Okay, so the quote that I have here on 408, machinery enlarges the amount of the substances that members of the capitalist class and their dependents can consume, and thus it enlarges these social strata whose growing wealth, together with the relatively smaller number of workers needed to produce the primary means of subsistence, creates both a new demand for luxury goods and the means for satisfying it.
Yeah, that's exactly the section I had marked.
Okay, yeah, so I was just thinking of this in the sense of basically increasing production for capitalists, for the capitalist class. They increase production so much that they have more and more disposable income, which creates more demand for luxury goods. How many fucking yachts does a person need? So it increases the demand for yachts because now they all have all this money they don't know what to do with. And so what that does ultimately is continue to create more and more division among the classes, which over time should increase class antagonism.
Yeah. Well, it's so weird because I'm just thinking about how luxury is completely constructed, you know, like there's obviously like maybe a natural element to maybe something being scarce or the knowledge being really esoteric or whatever. But like obviously what people considered luxury is something set by an expansion of surplus value. I mean, I'm just thinking about when he says enlarges the amount of substances the members of the capitalist class and their dependents can consume. I guess it's a chicken or the egg thing again, you know, like which came first, the luxury good or the expansion of the surplus capital? I mean, Marx here, I think, is saying the latter, right? The expansion of surplus capital led to the development of goods which could then soak up that extra surplus.
Yeah, it becomes a question. What I'm thinking of here is there are goods that are expensive because there's a lot of labor that embodies a lot of skill. I'm thinking like PRS guitars, like Swiss-made timepieces. They're not watches. Right. You know, like shit like that, where it requires a great deal of skill, which has with it quite a lot of labor value, right? And so they're expensive because of that. But then there are things that are manufactured to be luxury just because we have socially decided that that's true.
Yeah.
Like what makes one garment, you know, like a Prada bag nicer than any other fucking bag? The function is exactly the same.
Sure.
It holds shit.
Well, that's when it gets into like conspicuous consumption, you know, so.
I guess what I'm saying is like, I think that there is a material element and I think there's a social element.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're combined. Sometimes it's just more one than the other.
No, I think that's a good explanation because like that could be a description of something that is created as a luxury without necessarily involving the same enlargement of surplus, something that signals to your peers that this is luxury, the deluxe.
The deluxe.
Sorry, I was just thinking about that when we were talking about the cheapness of goods. When he talks about shirts being created with size in them, did you do any digging into that?
No.
I had no idea what that was, so I looked it up. Apparently, when you size a cloth, you add something to it, normally like a starch or a chemical or something. So to think of a sack that is 50% all additives, because it's sold by weight, so they were like, let's just make it as heavy as possible.
Yeah.
It's really funny. At work, we do something similar. I send off all my stuff on wood pallets to get recycled, and they take off from our total weight a flat rate. And I went to my boss and I was like, we should get heavier pallets, man, because then I would get more weight out of these. And they'd only take off 40%, you know, or 40 pounds or whatever. You know, just that same thing. I've done it. I've done the thing, man.
Yeah.
Shit.
I have a couple other things here from this chapter. Let's go to 399 if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Is that the first one I want to go to? Yeah, well, we just get the first of these quotes of what I would say this could be used for good, so to speak. On 399, this is actually coming from Uri.
Yeah.
Your URE person. Apologies all around.
Yeah.
Whenever a process requires a particular dexterity and steadiness of hand, it is withdrawn as soon as possible from the cunning workman, who is prone to irregularities of many kinds, and it is placed in charge of a peculiar mechanism so self-regulating that a child can superintend it. The idea being that, like, mechanization can be implemented so to make something simpler, safer, whatever, to require less labor from a laborer. And that could be used for good. That could be a thing where it's like, okay, now that is taken over, my efforts can be used elsewhere. But what a capitalist sees is, I no longer need a man to supervise it then. I can just use a child because it's so simple.
Yeah, I could have a half idiot there, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, totally. You know what I was just thinking about is that kind of in relation to AI, some of the most pragmatic answers I've heard about it so far have been to advocate for a shorter work week, you know? is to literally not extend, but literally detract the workday as far as you can with the forces of your own organization, because that's going to be what offsets it, right? Clearly, this technology is only going to be used to intensify our labor. So if we're going to counteract it in any actual way, maybe the most reasonable way is to advocate for less time on the job, simply to say, we demand more time for ourselves. Just to step out of our, utopian revolutionary schema or whatever, it's like that's something that could be organized for today.
Quick side note, at my job, between Memorial Day and Labor Day, we've gone to half-day Fridays. So everyone is off at noon on Fridays.
Yeah.
And they're like, enjoy your summer. This is a gift from the company. Everyone now has half-day until Labor Day. If we can do it for 3 months, we can do it all the time.
You could do it forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally, man. It reminds me of like at my job, for so long they bonused out every single quarter that people simply assumed it to be part of their thing. And it's like, clearly this is doable. The only reason we don't do it now is because, of some kind of systemic shock, our production has had to decrease because of a couple reasons I won't get into, obviously. But now, like, that bonus isn't there. And it's like, for so long we were able to do it at this level that should have just been our regular job. It should never have been a bonus at all. Mm-hmm. It's exactly the same thing.
That's a good point. Another quote similar to the last one on 406. Bourgeois political economists thus spare their own brains further effort as they accuse their opponents of stupidly targeting machinery itself, not the capitalist use of it. And I guess the reason I wrote this could be used for good thing is that machinery is just a tool, just like everything else.
Totally neutral.
Yeah, and so it's not inherently bad. Bourgeois political economists looking at machinery and decrying it for whatever reason, they're pointing their criticism at the wrong space.
Sure.
Where machinery could be used to increase production and, like you said, take us down to a 4-day work week, 3-day work week, whatever. Work 4 hours a day instead of 8.
Yeah.
All of that is possible through technological advancement. It's possible right fucking now.
I just shot myself in the foot, basically, because it's privileged to think about a 3-day work week, a 4-day work week, man. So many people don't exist within that structure anyway. At my fucking other job, what does a 4-day work week even mean? I get paid hourly,
I was thinking about that. Okay, so I guess quick side note about being educators. Mm-hmm. Back at our old school, when I was in a leadership position, during the COVID year, where we had kind of Fridays with no class, when we were working remotely, we all had Fridays, and every teacher talked about how much they liked having that day without class. I wouldn't call it an extra day, but they had a time that wasn't devoted to class that they could use for all of the ancillary things that teachers are required to do all of the time, like lesson planning, grading, all of the extra shit that takes up most of your time. And teachers loved having Fridays open with no class because almost all of them were reporting getting all of that shit done on Friday.
Yeah.
And then they had their life to live over the weekend instead of having to devote another day or two to getting all that shit done. And to the credit of our superintendent, I had a conversation with him about this, and he was like, is there a way we can make a 4-day work week work? Basically, like, is there a calendar that can be developed with 4 days of class? Teachers report on Fridays, students don't. And it was one of my special projects to look into doing that. And I worked on it very, very hard.
Yeah.
And I couldn't make it work basically because we are required to have students for a certain number of hours over the course of the year.
Interesting. Yeah.
And there just wasn't any way to do it. And so, like, I think when we talk about like a 4-day work week or whatever, there are a lot of jobs, teachers, nurses, any form of service, like retail service or anything like that, those people are not going to be considered in that.
Yeah.
Let alone the idea of it being a quote-unquote first world consideration, where the manufacturing of all of the shit that we're consuming conspicuously on our extra off day or whatever is still being manufactured elsewhere in brutal conditions.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too, is that, like, just as you said, that Friday, which was ostensibly free time, I mean, teachers still reported or whatever, but was still used for work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
it didn't reduce the productivity of the teacher.
Right. Well, yeah, but even then it's like, you've just shifted all the work that normally happens in the afternoons every day to one day in specific, which otherwise would have been free. It's like, I know that teaching is fucked up in so many ways, but I'm just thinking about the different kinds of jobs that if you said go down to 4 days, they would just offload so much more of their work onto somebody's personal time. Mm-hmm. It would just become homework in some capacity, regardless of what the law says.
Some salaried employee.
Teaching is a fucking great example because, I mean, I worked 7 to 7 every goddamn day, basically, whether that, especially my first year, because I was lesson planning every night, doing all sorts of shit. Like, oh my God.
Brutal.
Yeah, it was horrid. It was horrid. I felt like I did nothing else with my life. I wasted a ton of money because I would just get DoorDash all the time. That's a personal failure, not nothing else. Shout outs to my DoorDash drivers. This is not a spot to start discourse.
You're the real heroes.
Yes, that's right. I respect my boys in red. But, like that work was still my responsibility one way or the other. And it's not that the workday could have been expanded, nor would it have been useful to be expanded. But I just think in the same way, not that we shouldn't have a 4-day work week, but I'm just thinking of all the jobs where that other work is going to just be put on the employee as a consequence of the employer not having the time to do it. And putting it in that framework is giving too much to the employer. But that's just a concern of mine if we're talking about like today changes.
That's fair.
Especially as, just to tie it all back in, right? You have all of this extra brain work to do now on ostensibly your off time. What do you go to? Probably AI, right? If you have to reclaim that time in some way and the market option is to use ChatGPT, then of course people will do so because they see it as a selfish incentive. I need this time, which I had free to myself. Now I have to do my work in. I'll just go to the most available option, the cheapest option.
Yeah, well, what is happening right now, literally, is that people that have more to do than time to do it are turning to those things anyway.
Yeah.
Like, not to throw anybody under the bus or whatever, but that thing that I was talking about that I'm doing at my work, it's a report that I have to run and sort. My manager was like, I tried putting it into ChatGPT and it wouldn't work.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's like,
okay,
that fucking sucks.
I mean, it's just the little things. Like, this is just really irks me because, what it kind of is like this could have been used for good. Like a subject line in an email, it could have been used for good, right? It could genuinely be whatever you need. But the fact that people see it as something rote and export it, like an email is literally a form of communication. Business has compacted it down, compressed it down into this fucking horrid, ritualistic form of expression. But you still need to convey a message in an email, regardless of how many levels of business speak it has to go through. The fact that people are just offloading that is crazy. It's just the same thing where it's like we're offloading all of the wrong things onto AI, onto any technology in that sense.
I know that I have biased opinions about this as a former English educator because people should fucking know the difference between there, and there. They should know the difference between your and your. They should know when to use who and when to use whom. These are things that I feel very strongly that people should know. And the idea that now there is a tool that lets them write off their knowledge of that information just fucking boils my blood. And I know that is such a stupid, inconsequential thing. I get it.
But I don't think so because, I mean, what are you discounting when you discount that skill? All of language? Like, you're literally discounting your ability to communicate effectively through this medium of text when you do that kind of thing. Likewise, I think education is a great example because I've heard from some college students that they're like, I'll get like the tedium busy work, this and that. And it's like, that work all serves a purpose. I believe busy work exists, don't get me wrong. But like, you're using ChatGPT to respond to a classmate's blog post or something. I know from experience that those activities are boring and trite and nobody gives a shit. But it's not that they have to be that way.
Yeah.
Engaging in a discussion with your classmates is what that means to facilitate. And the fact that you are now even taking that limited capacity and diminishing it even further only harms yourself. Teachers assign things for a reason. Right? It's just the case. Like,
good ones, for sure.
I didn't just print out this coloring page to give to my fucking business class or whatever. Like, I'm giving you an assignment with, there's something here. Like, there's something for you to get here.
Yes, I agree. I think like the ability to reason and communicate effectively is at the core of the way that we use language, and that is a vital skill that everyone needs to have command of. I do also recognize that socially there is a hierarchy at place with the way language is used and weaponized to privilege some and discount others.
Sure.
So I think it is like a fraught conversation, so to speak. I don't think it should matter your email speak thing. I think that that's fucking stupid.
Right.
I hate that sort of shit. If you can communicate clearly, that's all that really is necessary. People shouldn't get up in arms or whatever about you saying sincerely instead of regards or something like that. You know what I mean?
Even on the other end of the spectrum, I think like A meeting that should have been an email is a consequence of that kind of failure. Your inability to synthesize this information into an email is generating a needless meeting. You know, like I'm not even joking. Like I think
Yeah.
that's seriously a real practical consequence of this kind of thing. It wastes our time because you don't know how to synthesize your information effectively. Probably because you spent the last 30 years saying, in regards to my previous email, please understand that, you know, like that is hurtful to us as a society. It could have been used for good. You know, an email job could have been for the greater good, goddammit.
Editor Aaron here. Just want to throw in one more thing. Sorry if I've said it on the show before, but there is a sentiment also that people are like, why didn't I learn how to do this in school? I should have taken a media literacy class. Why didn't they teach us this sort of shit? Bitch, that's what English class was. Maybe the curtains aren't just blue. Know what I mean? Okay, I don't know why I'm so heated. Back to the show. I did want to call out back to the text for a moment. I felt very vindicated while reading chapter 13 because there are a couple of moments where he's calling to things that I was like, this is just like my fucking table saw example from the last episode.
Dude, go ahead.
I felt really vindicated. At least one of the times is on 374. If the length of the workday is given and other conditions remain constant, then in order to exploit double the number of workers, a capitalist has to double the amount of constant capital he spends on not only raw material and auxiliary materials, but machinery and buildings too. If he can extend the workday, however, he can enlarge the scale of production without increasing the amount of capital put into machinery and buildings. That's exactly the example that I gave with the table saw. You need one table saw to hire one worker.
Yeah.
You need one table saw to hire two workers. It's exactly the same thing. The amount of constant capital doesn't have to change for the capitalists to find new ways to exploit and steal surplus labor.
Sure.
And that made me feel really good that I understood something.
Dude, it's like that prime mover thing again, you know, like one constant powers many people. You're expediting the exploitation of those other people.
Yeah.
And I've also felt vindicated. There's a point where he talks about 100% exploitation, and he literally gives an example where it's like, you do $64 in a day, that's $32. And I was like, I did this! I did this!
Yeah, it feels good.
Yeah, we're doing it, guys! Just to talk about the international struggle again, like, looking back on 407, he says, as for raw material, there is no doubt that rapid advances in cotton spinning not only had a hothouse effect on the expansion of cotton production in the United States and in turn on the African slave trade, they also made breeding blacks into one of the leading businesses in the so-called border slave states. So, I don't want to say unintended, but it's like an unintended consequence of this expansion, which, you know, you could look at and say is for the best. Not slavery, obviously, but like textiles, right? If people need textiles, the expansion of the textile industry is a good thing, but it comes with all these global ramifications because of that ultimate division of labor, just like we were talking about.
Yeah.
And he makes a mention about Ireland right below it as well. I don't know if that was in relation to the famine. I don't know my dates for that.
Nor do I.
So,
I couldn't speak.
sorry if you're an Irish listener. You can let us know, leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, this kind of section here of the chapter, I have a quote from even back on 397. I think he's kind of outlining all of the different ways that this development of machinery ultimately destroys workers and puts laborers into more and more precarious situations of exploitation up until even, like you said, the manufacturing of the slave trade.
Yeah.
This quote in the middle of the page, though, the whole system of capitalist production rests on the circumstance that the worker sells his labor power as a commodity. The division of labor narrows his labor power to the point where it becomes a very particular competence in handling a specialized tool. Then, when his tool falls prey to a machine, the exchange value of his labor power immediately vanishes along with its use value. It's just another example of the way this technological advancement in machinery is ultimately destroying workers.
Yeah. I even love on the page opposite, contemporary writers thus tended to treat the divisions of labor as a means of replacing workers, but not of dislodging actual workers. The distinction is clear. If someone says it would take 100 million people using old spinning wheels to spin as much, this doesn't mean the mule displaced all of those millions of workers, right? But if a loom puts out 800,000 workers in England, he is speaking of real machinery that a certain number of workers would be needed to replace.
Yeah.
There is a real effect of all of this at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, okay, I'll call a couple of quotes out about colonialism because he throws a few out here. I'm going to jump to 414, actually.
Okay.
I've got a few there's even one from the last chapter, but he's talking about the production of cotton. At the same time, the low cost of machine-made products and the revolutionized transportation and communication systems function as weapons for conquering foreign markets. By wiping out their artisanal products, machine-driven production forcibly turns those foreign markets into the fields that produce raw material for machines. And this is where I wrote United Fruit Company, Honduras. I'm just thinking of like all of the ways that capital forces its way into other countries, colonizes them for the sake of stealing raw materials from them. Congo's another perfect example, stealing raw materials from them and then mechanizing the industry and having full control over it, monopolizing that to the point where no one has any option other than to toil. And
dude, even in the, I mean, God, you know, I'm just thinking it even goes back to like the mercantile system, you know, we send you all of our manufactured goods. You cannot buy manufactured goods from anywhere else. You give us all the raw resources that we use. It's like such an exploitative relationship on its face. I don't know how anyone could argue otherwise without supremacy, without domination.
Yeah. He spends the next like 20 pages talking about the kind of the Factory Act, talking about the employment of women and children and the exploitation. There are a couple of banger quotes in there.
Definitely. I mean, there's some interesting stuff, too, about how, like, something that Marx mentions that I think is both positive and negative, the way he frames it, is that the introduction of machinery broke the kind of patriarchal domination in the manufacturing system. You know, because women could work on these machines, they did. I mean, there are examples, obviously, where that doesn't happen. Like in the coal miner example, he says that women weren't allowed to work underground after 1845. It's not that they weren't involved in the coal industry, because they were still able to. The physical requirements to create surplus value were lowered. I'm thinking about disability, because in a kind of a Marxist framing, right, what qualifies you as disabled is your inability to make profit. But you see, as these channels of production open up, there is more space for those people in those places to be productive in the sense of generating surplus value. I'm not saying that that disqualifies them from being disabled or whatever, but it's just that, like, the social definition of invalidity, of disability, is changed through our methods of production. And I think that there's an interesting parallel there in the way that he says that women entered the workforce because they could then work the machines that were being introduced, whereas before there were some segments of industry where women couldn't participate at all. And it's not that Marx says that that's good or bad, other than, you know, the exploitative aspect of it, which he clearly thinks is bad. It's just interesting. It's interesting.
The one I was looking at is on 365. The worker used to sell his own labor power, which as a person free in principle, he could dispose of however he saw fit. Now he sells his wife and child. He becomes a slave trader.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right below it, too. Wanted advertisements for child workers often look just like the notices from prospective buyers of slaves. I wrote, ouch, next to it, because it's just a straight shot.
And what will pass for 13 years of age?
Yeah, dude. Oh, my God. We didn't really talk about how Marx talks about child labor. I don't want to get into that because we seem to get ourselves in trouble. But I just want to be clear that... Sorry, I was looking away from the camera there. The camera. We always get ourselves in trouble. But I want to be clear that Marx is very aware of the needs of a child. I mean, he literally talks about how the expansion of the workday, the inclusion of children, has taken away from their developmental time, has taken away from their play time. I mean, he talks about how farcical the educational system mandated by the Factory Acts is. And honestly, it didn't sound that too far off, you know. Hundreds of children stuffed into one classroom, many children doing absolutely nothing at all. I was like, wow, geez, wow.
What do you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite clear that he's being critical of the exploitation of children.
Yeah.
And I think he has every right to be. We don't need to get into child labor yet, because I'm sure we will say something.
No, yeah, exactly. You know, we're talking about literal child labor here. I mean, God, when he talks about, like, all the different ways that people are literally mangled by machines, and he's like, when you go to the silk farms, it's even worse because children run the machines themselves. It's like...
There's that table of consumption in children that is fucking wild.
Consumption, man. Which he says becomes a condition of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a side effect, but it's like part of the condition itself.
On 428, in 1852, 1 in 45 children. In 1861, 1 in 8. That's
1 in 8?
fucking bonkers.
1 in 8?
Yeah.
Consumption?
Yeah.
What the fuck is that? I know what consumption is.
This rise in the rate of consumption really ought to silence both the most optimistic champions of progress and the biggest liars among the German peddlers of free trade.
Yeah. Thank God, even when he talks about 67 cubic feet per person, you know what a foot looks like. I'm talking to you too, listener. You can imagine what a square foot looks like even. You can do it with your hands, right?
Yeah.
Make that a cube, and then imagine 67 of those. You know, if you think about what cubed, sorry to get into the math here, equals like 67, we're talking about like 4. Think of a 4 by 4 by 4 cube of cubed feet. That's all the space you get. That's smaller than like your bathroom space. Your shower probably has that much space in it.
Mm-hmm.
This shit was no joke, man. Think that rounds out our machinery section?
No, I don't really have much else. We might as well jump to chapter 14, Absolute and Relative Surplus Value. This is the first chapter of part 5 of the book. Again, sorry for the confusion if you're reading from another translation.
Yeah, we were misled by the wicked David Harvey, who in his syllabus... No, I'm just joking. Yeah, as we've said before, we're technically 2 chapters behind the place that this would be in the original translation. That's why the David Harvey syllabus has chapter 15 split into 2 parts. It's because it's all of the machinery chapter, which makes sense because it was long.
Yeah.
You know, so again, reader, sorry for the confusion. We're reading from the newest translation by the Pauls.
The Pauls.
Yeah, shout outs. There is one weird note on 470 though. This isn't really a cavalcade, so I don't mind bringing it up right now. But he says, the great building projects of ancient Egypt owe less to the sheer size of the population and the fact that such a large part of it was available to work.
Available.
Do you mean
doing a lot of work there.
slaves?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you mean slavery? Am I misled here, listener? I don't know if available is necessarily the right terminology.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Like we had said earlier, Marx does some kind of weird stuff when he talks about absolute versus relative surplus value. I think I feel pretty clear on what the distinction is.
I feel pretty good. This chapter is fine, but I just didn't have much to comment on.
I love on the next page when he says, volume 4 of this book. Sorry, dude. You didn't even make it to
that.
3. I know. I love it, man. This guy... He just said, fuck it. We ball. Like,
He was ambitious.
I'm doing 6 of these. This chapter a lot is like, it is summary. For one, he already defined absolute and relative surplus value. He talks about how it no longer suffices to extend the process. It must be remade. These are all things that we talked about in the last 2 chapters. There's that bit about merchant and usury capital.
Yeah.
I don't know. You want to just hit the cavalcade?
Yeah, fuck it. Let's just jump into the cavalcade.
It's the cavalcade.
Quotes.
Yeah, I love on 332. This is the quote I actually starred twice. If workers originally sold their labor power to capital because they lacked the material means to produce commodity, their own labor power now can't perform its service when it isn't sold to capital. Right, a little further down he says, workers in the manufacturing system are branded as capital's property by the division of labor. Now, there might be some self-deprecating anti-Semitism there for Marx, but I'm going to pass on that one for now.
Yeah.
Can I just say, anytime Marx talks about man as part of an engine, I can't help but think of Snowpiercer, and it really pisses me off because the movie's fine, it's okay. But I can't get that picture of the kid fucking reaching in and pulling out the engine grease with his little hand every damn time he said, especially when he was saying that people are the hands of the machine. I was like, no, please, the machine never stops.
I have one on 362.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, this is with reference to women in the mines. Before it was forbidden to employ women and children under 10 in mines, capital worked naked women and girls to the bone there, often together with men, doing so in a way it found to be so warmly sanctioned by its moral code, and especially its ledgers, that it didn't introduce machinery until after such practices were banned.
Right.
I guess I highlighted that for the cavalcade just to demonstrate pardon the double entendre, I guess, but the naked nature of capitalism's exploitation, the willingness that it has to just to the bone.
And just as we've talked about before, how it is literally cheaper to use people than it is to use machines, the point at which that changes will cause the change in the production as well. I always think of the McDonald's kiosks, man. I can't help it. But if I may skip ahead, there's something related to that way deep on 433. I actually totally skimmed over it earlier. But he says, it is in fact because human sweat and blood became less and less expensive in the form of commodities, the form they are transformed into, that the market kept expanding and is still expanding daily. Right? Like literally, we are thinking of humanity, of their muscle, of their blood, of their sweat, of their body as the commodity here. And I know we've been talking about labor as a commodity, but that comes with it it's an extension of its own kind of machine, like the human machine, right? It takes a toll on that machine. And maybe even in the similar way of the way we've been talking about machines dispersing their value over many objects, we are conforming humans into the same semblance of machinery, essentially. Like we're exuding sweat, toil, blood, etc. for the cost as part of our value being distributed to all of our goods that we're making. I don't know. I just really love that about sweat and blood as commodity.
Yeah. I'll kick it way back to 364. It's actually a footnote. So let me read the quote that he's referencing here. It technically starts at the bottom of 363. Forced labor for the capitalist usurped the place of not only children's play, but also the independent domestic labor families perform for themselves within certain traditional limits.
Yeah.
And then we get in this footnote, Marx writes, speaking of folks in the home, they also gained enough time to learn how to cook. Unfortunately, though, they became skilled in the art of cooking at a moment when they had nothing to eat.
Yeah, it's when he talks about Godfrey's cordial, which I looked up, and it's laudanum.
Oh.
Yeah. To a serious extent, it was so heavily used in England that, it became a problem. Rather than breastfeed their kids because they either didn't have the nutrition or the time, they would give them fucking opiates.
Oh.
Fucking boomers did the same shit, man, Oh, your kid's got teething pains? Rub a little whiskey on there,
put a little whiskey.
Yeah. A hot toddy, man, before you go to bed or whatever. Like, some shit like that.
Fucking wild.
Yeah. And I was going to crack a joke about fucking leaded gasoline. Shout out to John Kettering, the namesake of a nearby city. But that report just came out that vapes are pumping lead directly into our kids all day long.
Cool.
Woohoo! Yeah. Shout out to the boomers.
Shout out, boomers.
This is less cavalcade, but I did get an answer to that question that I had in the last segment of Capital we read. Because I had asked, what makes the difference between historical cooperation and capitalist cooperation?
Oh.
I really got the vibe here. And it's that shift between people using tools and tools using people.
Becoming merely conscious organs, is that
right.
it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Coordinated with its unconscious. Both sets of organs are subordinated to the same central motive force. I just think that really made it clear because... Yeah, on the next page is when he says the central motive machine is not just an automaton, but an autocrat too.
Yeah.
And in the same way, when the capitalist is speaking to his, quote, hands, unquote, and he says, basically, you should know your place. Like, the point of value in this workshop is not you, the hands. You can be easily replaced with anybody off the street. The real value is in the machine.
I have a quote on 390 that I kind of just liked the language that he uses. He really does evoke imagery of like zombies and death when he's describing a lot of this stuff. Also, there's a Sisyphus shout out, so shout out to that. But right above that, in the manufacturing workshop, workers are the limbs of a living mechanism. In the factory, a dead mechanism exists independently of them, and they are incorporated into it as living appendages. I just love the turn of phrase there.
Yeah, the opposite page is that quote on the hands. Whenever he clashes with his, quote, hands, he says to them contemptuously, the factory operative should keep in wholesome remembrance the fact that theirs is really a low species of skilled labor. There is none which is more easily acquired or of its quality more amply remunerated. I was not ready for that one. Can I just say we've been over the hill for a minute now, but I am really enjoying this. I'm eager to finish it, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I know we have it spread out quite expansively, but I've been having a ball whenever we read Capital.
I think that that's to our benefit. I really do believe that. I think it's helping me make connections more directly because things are on the top of my mind. We just read something and then it's like, oh, shit.
Yeah. Well, and even too, if we tried to cram this all into, I don't know, even 2 episodes, there wouldn't be a chance.
No fucking way.
Yeah, no.
Another quick one on 392, he's talking about the factory code. It is merely a capitalist caricature of society's regulation. And then he closes that by saying the supervisor's list of penalties functions as once did the slave owner's whip.
Yeah, I love in the footnote there, he must eat, drink, and sleep at command. The despotic bell calls him from bed, his breakfast, his dinner. What a time of it he has, too, inside the factory. Here, the employer is the absolute lawgiver. He makes regulations at will, changes and adds to his codex at pleasure, and even if he inserts the craziest stuff, the courts say to the working man, you are your own master. No one forced you to agree to such a contract if you did not wish to, but now when you have freely entered into it, you must be bound by it.
Yeah.
Fucking God damn, dude. There is something on 440 that I actually really liked, because the last time we talked about capital, we talked about how innovation could be a form of organization. And I think that here's a great example that runs in parallel to our modern day. As trains and telegraphs have become more widespread, so have such orders. The extension of the railway system throughout the country, notes a London manufacturer, has tended very much to encourage giving short notice. What that made me think of was just-in-time delivery. You know, the way that all modern retail shops work is that they, essentially through a central program, track all of their inventory, and as soon as it runs out, or as soon as it's projected to run out even, they do another order. And if something happens in that supply chain, the shelf remains unfilled. You know,
Yeah.
It's an innovation that has allowed retailers like Walmart to dominate, because they simply don't have to have the same kind of expenditure at the cost of a more strained relation to their supply chain. But I even love below that, he says, years ago, we were able to work in the slack time so as to meet demand for the next season. But now, no one can say beforehand what will be in demand then. It's like, yeah, these innovations have allowed us to maximize our efficiencies of production, or consumption, really, I should say.
Yeah.
But with it comes its own thing. I mean, there's a lot to say here, even, I think, about famines, you know. I read a great book that talks about how every famine is a political decision, essentially. And he talked really about, like, the British famines in India and also in China. And how, like, this exact kind of problem kind of reared its ugly head, not just because of supply chain issues, but just because of this relationship of domination that had happened, you know, this kind of maximization of labor, these kinds of practices, especially such as he talks about here with the way that short notice on goods, they can't predict the harvests and whatnot. Yeah. It's like all of that leads to these kinds of large scale disasters, which, you know, I'm not saying wouldn't have happened otherwise, but like it would have happened a little differently at least, you know? And I just think that's really on my mind here. I mean, God, where the fuck is Trump with his tariffs right now? Are we still doing those? Because like when he pulled those out, I was like, holy shit, in 1 month we're gonna be in chaos. You know, we're gonna be living in the fucking Thunderdome, man.
They're still paused, I believe, for most places.
Trump always chickens out.
No, he's playing 4D chess, bro.
There is something I do want to mention. We touched on it briefly about how this toll is taken not only on humanity but also on the environment. I think Marx does a bit of that on 460 and 461 to talk about. He says that, you know, it disrupts the metabolizing that goes on between human beings and the earth. The natural elements that people consume can no longer return to the land. Hence, capitalist production undermines the eternal natural condition of the earth's lasting fertility, thereby ruining the physical health of the urban worker and the intellectual life of the rural one.
Yeah, I just wrote a note there about infinite growth with finite resources, because it's exactly that. And he's talking about it specifically in this context of the natural world, but also the same thing is true of the exploitation of the worker.
Yeah.
Overly exploiting, overly extracting from that worker is shortening their life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even that, you know, like, I've said this quote on the show before, but, you know, it's like the greatest artist of all time is working a 9 to 5 right now, or whatever. It's like there is literally potential lost in these. Like this resource, so to speak, this creative potential is like obliterated. It's crushed, you know. It only becomes accessible to the elite. And heads up, elites tend to make pretty shitty art. I hate to break it to you, but, you know, go look up Adrian Brody's artwork if you want a great example, man. It's fucking... Whoo!
That's why they need AI.
Yeah, I agree. No, I don't agree. What am I saying?
I'm not saying that's why they should have
that's why they
it. I'm
should
saying
use
that's
it.
why they need it.
No, dude. Just give it a couple years, bro. It'll be transgressive at that point. Fucking whatever. Even just to cap that off, right, at the bottom of 461. By bottom, I mean 1/3 down the page, because there's then a footnote. But he says, capitalist production thus advances the technological means of social production and combines those processes more and more only by damaging the very founts of all wealth, the earth and the worker.
Yep.
Beautiful. I think that's it.
Yeah. So does chapters 12, 13, and 14 of Dr. Karl Marx's Capital.
Yes. What questions did this leave you with, Aaron?
I don't have any explicit questions. The rhetorical questions that I was asking myself, and I think will continue to ask myself as technology develops, is, I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. How will AI be the undoing of all humanity?
Yeah, that was my question too. When are we doing Butlerian jihad? You know, when are we not transcending, but maybe descending? You know, yeah. Is Peter Thiel the Antichrist for real? For real? should I create a fake LinkedIn profile and antagonize boomers into believing that AI is the Antichrist? In fact, I'm seeing it now. Antichrist, but the AI are just big, bold. I'll do it in the Disney font too. Fuck it, man.
You've got a plan. Yeah, okay. So any questions, thoughts, concerns?
Other interpretations? Other reading that you'd like us to check out?
Yeah, we do have a running list of recommendations from listeners of the show, which we do pull from and do intend to get to. So please, any feedback at all, send that our way at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
That's right. Definitely let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Follow us on TikTok so you can be ready for next time when we are going to read...
Oh, guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, Che Guevara.
Yeah, Che Guevara.
Really looking forward to that.
Yes, me too. Very excited. We haven't read anything about Cuba, have we?
Nope.
Nah, so this will be numero uno, and just in time, too, for another anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. I sure hope you join us.
Make sure you have your copy of Guerrilla Warfare to read along with us, because you don't want to get left unread.
Take it easy.
Bye-bye.